Hey, deep divers, welcome back for another deep dive with us. Before we get started, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and click the bell icon, so you never miss a deep dive with us. Today we're tackling a topic that might sound kind of dry at first, but trust me, it's anything but. The Bretton Woods system. Ever heard of it? Maybe not. But you've definitely felt its impact. We're talking global finance, international power dynamics, and how it all ties back to your everyday life. Buckle up, because this is one wild ride through history, economics, and even a bit of international intrigue.
It's funny you should mention intrigue, because the story of Bretton Woods starts with a gathering that could rival any spy thriller. Picture this, 1944. World War II is still raging, but leaders from 44 allied nations meet in a remote New Hampshire hotel. Their mission, to rebuild a world shattered by war and prevent future economic catastrophes.
Wow, 44 nations in the middle of a world war. Talk about a high-stakes meeting. But why hotel in New Hampshire? That seems like a kind of random choice for a global financial summit.
Well, they needed a neutral and secure location, far from the battlefields of Europe. And believe it or not, the Mount Washington Hotel fit the bill. Plus, the U.S. was emerging as a global superpower, so it made sense for them to host.
Okay, I get this setting. But what exactly did these leaders hope to achieve? What was the goal of the Bretton Woods Conference?
Essentially, they wanted to create a new global financial order, a system that would foster stability, cooperation, and economic growth. Remember, the world was still reeling from the Great Depression, which had deepened the political and social turmoil leading up to the war. They were determined to avoid repeating those mistakes.
So it was all about preventing another economic meltdown and paving the way for a more prosperous future.
Exactly. They believed that a stable global economy was crucial for maintaining peace and security. And they saw international cooperation, not isolationism, as the key to achieving this.
No, this all sounds pretty ambitious. How did they actually go about creating this new financial order? Was there like a giant whiteboard with flowcharts and equations?
Maybe not a whiteboard, but there were definitely some brilliant minds hashing out complex ideas. The outcome was the Bretton Woods Agreement, a landmark pact that established a system of fixed exchange rates pegged to the U.S. dollar, which in turn was pegged to gold.
Wait, so all currencies were tied to the US dollar and the dollar was linked to gold? Why such a complicated setup?
The goal was to create predictability and stability in international trade. With fixed exchange rates, countries knew exactly how much their currency was worth relative to others. This made trade less risky and encouraged investment.
That makes sense. I guess fluctuating exchange rates could create a lot of uncertainty and volatility in the global market. But didn't the system essentially give the US a lot of power?
It did. The U.S. dollar became the world's reserve currency, meaning other countries held dollars as a store of value and for international transactions. This gave the U.S. significant influence over the global economy.
So the US was essentially calling the shots.
To a large extent, yes. But keep in mind that this arrangement also came with responsibilities. The U.S. was expected to manage its economy responsibly and maintain the dollar's value in relation to gold.
Okay, so we've got this new system of fixed exchange rates and the US dollar as the world's reserve currency. But didn't the Bretton Woods Agreement also give birth to some institutions we know pretty well today?
You're absolutely right. This conference saw the creation of two major players on the global financial stage: the International Monetary Fund, or IMF, and the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, which later became the World Bank. You could say they were the Bretton Woods twins, born out of the same desire for a more stable and prosperous world.
Interesting. So the Bretton Woods system was more than just a set of rules. It also involved establishing institutions to oversee and manage this new global financial order. I'm guessing the IMF and World Bank had pretty specific roles to play.
Absolutely. The IMF's primary mission was to oversee the fixed exchange rate system, ensuring its smooth operation and providing short-term loans to countries facing balance of payment problems. Basically, they were there to prevent currency crises and keep the global financial system stable.
So kind of like the world financial referee, making sure everyone played by the rules.
That's a great analogy. They were there to monitor, advise, and lend a helping hand when needed.
What about the World Bank? What was its role in all of this?
Initially, the World Bank focused on reconstructing war-torn Europe, providing loans for infrastructure projects and economic development.
I guess after a world war, there was a lot of rebuilding to do.
Yeah,
But did the World Bank's mission evolve over time?
it did. As Europe recovered, the World Bank shifted its focus to developing countries, particularly those struggling with poverty and lack of access to basic necessities. They began providing loans and grants for a wide range of projects, from education and healthcare to infrastructure and agriculture.
So the World Bank went from rebuilding Europe to tackling global poverty. That's a pretty significant shift.
It is, and it reflects the growing awareness that economic development is crucial for global stability and prosperity. The idea was that by investing in developing countries, you could help lift people out of poverty, create new markets, and foster a more peaceful and prosperous world.
Okay, so we've laid the groundwork for understanding the Bretton Woods system. Fixed exchange rates, the U.S. dollar as the reserve currency, and the creation of the IMF and World Bank. But I'm guessing this is just the tip of the iceberg. What were some of the key features of this system, and how did it shape the global economy in the decades that followed?
Well, that's where things start to get really interesting. But before we get into that, let's take a quick pause.
Sounds good. We've covered a lot of ground already, and I'm sure our listeners could use a moment to digest all this information. When we come back, we'll delve deeper into the intricacies of the Bretton Woods system and explore how it shaped the world we live in today. So stay tuned.
Welcome back, Deep Divers. Before the break, we set the stage for the Bretton Woods system. Now let's take a closer look at some of its less obvious features. One of the most intriguing aspects was its embrace of both open markets and joint management, seemingly contradictory ideas that formed the bedrock of this new financial order.
Okay, that does sound a bit like an oxymoron. How can you have open markets and joint management at the same time? Doesn't that go against the whole idea of free trade and competition?
It's a delicate balance for sure. The idea was to move away from the protectionist policies and trade wars that had plagued the pre-war era. Remember back then, countries often tried to shield their own industries by slapping tariffs on foreign goods or forming exclusive trade blocs.
Right, I remember learning about Smoot-Hawley in history class. Talk about a disaster. Didn't that actually worsen the Great Depression?
Exactly. The Bretton Woods architects wanted to avoid a repeat of that debacle. They believed that open markets with reduced trade barriers would foster greater economic integration and boost global growth. Think of it as a tide that lifts all boats.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
But where does the joint management part come in?
Well, they recognized that open markets alone wouldn't solve all the problems. They needed a mechanism to manage the system to ensure stability, address imbalances, and prevent crises. That's where the IMF came in.
So the IMF was more than just a currency watchdog.
Precisely. The IMF was entrusted with the responsibility of overseeing the fixed exchange rate system and providing financial assistance to countries facing economic difficulties. It was a way for nations to collectively manage the global economy and prevent individual countries from going rogue and destabilizing the entire system.
So it was like a global safety net, ensuring that a crisis in one country wouldn't trigger a domino effect across the world.
Exactly. It was a remarkable shift from the every nation for itself mentality of the pre-war period. This spirit of cooperation also extended to the realm of trade. While not directly established at Bretton Woods, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or DO-ATT, which later evolved into the World Trade Organization, emerged from the same philosophy.
Yay. The precursor to the WTO, the organization we often hear about in trade disputes these days. So this whole system was built on the idea of working together, even if it meant giving up some individual control over economic policies.
You got it. The Bretton Woods architects understood that in an interconnected world, everyone benefits from a stable and predictable global economy.
Okay, so we've got open markets, joint management, the IMF as the referee and cat, setting the stage for global trade rules. That's a lot to unpack. But I'm guessing this system, as groundbreaking as it wasn't without its flaws. Were there any cracks in this seemingly well-constructed financial order?
Well, no system is perfect, right? As with any grand experiment, there were some unintended consequences and inherent challenges. The Bretton Woods system, despite its noble goals, wasn't immune to these.
This is where things get really interesting for me. Spill the tea.
Yeah.
What were some of the problems that emerged with this new system?
Well, one of the biggest issues was the very thing that gave the U.S. so much power. The dollar's role as the world's reserve currency.
You mean the fact that everyone was holding U.S. dollars?
Exactly. As the global economy grew and demand for dollars increased, the U.S. faced a dilemma. They had to print more dollars to keep up with demand, but this risked undermining the dollar's value and, by extension, the stability of the entire system.
It sounds like a catch-22 situation.
It was, and this tension eventually led to the collapse of the Bretton Woods system in the early 1970s when President Nixon decided to unpeg the dollar from gold.
Whoa, so the whole system just crumbled.
While it underwent a major transformation, the fixed exchange rate system was abandoned, and most countries adopted a floating exchange rate system where the value of their currencies is determined by market forces.
So no more gold standard.
Not in the way it existed under Bretton Woods.
This all sounds pretty dramatic.
Yeah.
What happened to the IMF and World Bank? Did they just disappear after Bretton Woods fell apart?
Not at all. They proved to be remarkably adaptable. Even though the fixed exchange rate system was gone, they continued to play important roles in the global economy, albeit in somewhat modified ways. The IMF shifted its focus to providing loans and policy advice to countries facing balance of payments crises, especially those struggling with debt or currency volatility.
So they became more like a global financial firefighter, rushing in to put out economic fires.
That's a great way to put it. And the World Bank continued its work in developing countries, focusing on poverty reduction, sustainable development, and investing in human capital through projects in education, healthcare, and infrastructure.
So even though the Bretton Woods system, as originally conceived, didn't last, its legacy lives on through these institutions.
Absolutely. And they continue to grapple with complex challenges, from financial crises to climate change to global pandemics.
It sounds like we've only scratched the surface of this topic. I'm curious to know more about the modern-day roles of the IMF and World Bank, criticisms they face, and how they might evolve in the future.
Well, that's a whole other chapter in the Bretton Woods saga, and one we'll definitely explore in the next part of our deep dive. Welcome back to the Deep Dive, Deep Divers. We've journeyed from the grand vision of Bretton Woods to the realities of a constantly evolving global financial landscape. But as we've hinted, the story doesn't end there. The IMF and World Bank, the institutions born from that historic 1944 meeting, are still very much alive, albeit with a fair share of baggage and ongoing debates about their future roles.
Yeah, it's fascinating how these institutions have managed to adapt and survive. And despite the seismic shifts in the global economy over the decades, I mean, they've gone from overseeing a fixed exchange rate system to navigating a world of floating currencies, complex financial instruments, and emerging economic powerhouses.
It's like they had to reinvent themselves multiple times to stay relevant.
Exactly. But I'm guessing this constant evolution hasn't been without its critics. What are some of the main criticisms leveled at the IMF and World Bank today?
One of the most persistent criticisms is that they're still dominated by developed countries, particularly the US and Europe, which hold a disproportionate amount of voting power. Critics argue that this creates a bias towards policies that favor the interests of wealthy nations, sometimes at the expense of developing countries.
So it's an issue of power and representation. Like the old saying goes, he who has the goal makes the rules.
It's a valid concern. There's a fear that developing countries are often forced to accept conditions attached to IMF loans or World Bank projects that may not align with their own development priorities or social needs.
Right, and I've heard the term structural adjustment programs thrown around in this context. What exactly does that entail, and why is it so controversial?
Structural adjustment programs are essentially a set of economic policy reforms that countries are often required to implement as a condition for receiving IMF loans. These reforms can include things like austerity measures, privatization of state-owned enterprises, and trade liberalization.
So it's kind of like a tough love approach to economic management. Tighten your belts, open up your markets, and get your house in order.
That's one way to look at it. But critics argue that these measures can be too harsh, especially for countries already struggling with poverty and inequality. They argue that austerity, for instance, can lead to cuts in essential social services, exacerbating hardship for the most vulnerable populations.
Yeah, so it's a delicate balance between promoting economic stability and protecting the well-being of people.
Yeah.
I can see how these programs can be seen as a form of economic colonialism, where powerful countries dictate terms to less developed nations.
It's a complex issue with no easy answers. And it's not just about economic policies. There are also concerns about the social and environmental impact of World Bank projects. Critics point to large-scale infrastructure projects like dams or mining operations that have displaced communities, damaged ecosystems, or contributed to climate change.
Right, and that brings up another major criticism I've heard, that these institutions created in a different era aren't adequately equipped to deal with the challenges of the 21st century, like climate change, global pandemics, and rising inequality.
That's a valid point. The world has changed dramatically since 1944. We have new economic powers, new technologies, and new threats that require a different approach to global governance.
So what's the solution? Should we just scrap the IMF and World Bank and start over?
It's not that simple. These institutions have a lot of experience, expertise, and resources. The question is how to reform them to make them more effective, accountable, and responsive to the needs of the 21st century.
So more evolution, not revolution.
Exactly. There are already initiatives underway to increase the voting power of developing countries, to incorporate environmental and social considerations into lending and project decisions, and to focus more on issues like climate change and sustainable development.
It sounds like there's a recognition that these institutions need to adapt to survive. But will these reforms be enough to address the fundamental critiques and ensure their legitimacy in the long run?
That remains to be seen. The world is watching closely to see if the IMF and World Bank can truly transform themselves and become genuine partners in building a more just, equitable, and sustainable global economy.
Well, deep divers, I think we've given you a pretty thorough deep dive into the Bretton Woods system, its legacy, and the ongoing debates about its future.
We've explored its origins, its key features, the institutions it created, and the criticisms it faces. Hopefully, you now have a deeper understanding of this complex system and its impact on the world we live in.
It's a topic that continues to evolve, and we encourage you to stay curious, keep learning, and engage in these important conversations. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and click the bell icon so you never miss an episode.
Until next time, keep exploring the depths of knowledge.